She was the only woman in California who didn't want the billionaire, and the only one he wanted. She didn't run. That was the part everyone watching would later misunderstand. Leora Gibson walked down the stone steps of the cliffside estate at the same pace she used every morning when she left her apartment in Oakland, steady, unhurried, carrying nothing except a folded note in her pocket. The Pacific stretched wide behind her, darkening as the evening fell, while camera shutters cracked open the quiet like sudden thunder. Reporters called her name as if they had known her all along. A woman who had once argued over used paperbacks was now framed as something rare, something valuable, something they felt entitled to explain. She kept moving, not toward safety, not toward comfort, away. People had watched her exit private helicopters, step onto yachts that didn't bother with docks, stand in rooms where silence was more expensive than the art on the walls. The world assumed she had arrived at the finish line, that whatever story had led her here was finally over. But that night, with cameras snapping as if history were happening without their permission, the real contradiction stood in plain view. Leora Gibson was not being abandoned. She was leaving, not because she was hurt, not because she had been betrayed. She walked away with a straight spine and clear eyes, as if the grand home behind her were no more binding than a cafe she no longer felt like sitting in. The woman who had nothing had once carried herself this way. The woman who had everything was doing it again, and nobody could understand why. Have you ever woken up in a place you never chose and felt like your own name didn't quite fit there? Not because anything was wrong on the surface. The address was impressive, the view impossible to complain about, yet something essential felt borrowed. As though your routines had been edited, your preferences softened, your voice slowly translated into a version that made other people more comfortable. At first, it feels harmless. You compromise on little things. You stop correcting assumptions. You accept invitations you never would have accepted before. Then one day you realize the conversations around you no longer require your honesty, only your presence. That is the quiet fear most people don't know how to explain, not losing someone else, losing the way you recognize yourself when no one is watching. The world likes clean stories. It prefers winners, upgrades, and obvious trades. If someone powerful chooses you, the narrative insists you should become grateful. If your life expands in square footage and headlines, you are expected to shrink emotionally to make room for it. That was the tension tightening around Leora long before she ever wrote her goodbye note. Every dinner reservation began to feel like a performance. Every introduction carried an invisible price tag. The more attention gathered around their relationship, the less space remained for quiet mistakes, awkward pauses, unfinished sentences, the fragile things that make connection real. Affection didn't vanish. It changed shape, and in that new shape, love started to feel like something being managed rather than lived. Here is the question the headlines never managed to answer. What kind of woman steps out of a life most people chase their entire lives, not because it collapsed, not because she was pushed, but because staying would have cost her something she wasn't willing to trade? She didn't leave money. She left a version of herself that had begun to feel rented. Somewhere between the private drivers, the curated dinners, and the carefully guarded silences, Leora realized she had stopped choosing anything that mattered. Comfort had replaced curiosity. Access had replaced freedom. The world believed she had been rescued, but rescue only counts when you asked for it. So why did she walk away from the man everyone wanted? Because being admired is not the same as being known. Before the story carries you back to the beginning, before the coffee shop, the quiet conversations, the life neither of them expected, pause with this question for a moment. If wealth enters a relationship, does it simply exist there, or does it begin to rewrite the rules? Think about it. About how power shifts when one person can open doors the other never has to walk through. About how quickly admiration turns into expectation, and how easily generosity becomes control without anyone intending it. I'd like you to tell me what you believe. Can money ever remain neutral when two people are trying to build something honest together, or does it always tilt the ground beneath their feet? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective shapes this channel more than you know. Leora's apartment never pretended to be anything other than what it was. The pipes knocked before dawn like they were reminding her she had already slept long enough. The heater exhaled air that arrived late to every room, and the kitchen light flickered with the kind of inconsistency that eventually teaches you patience or surrender. She owned 3 mugs, each chipped in a different place, and rotated between them, as if that small variety qualified as luxury. Outside, Oakland stirred in fragments. A bus sighing to a stop, A neighbor arguing with a phone call that had clearly started hours ago, music drifting through walls too thin to carry secrets. She moved through it all with practiced efficiency, hair twisted into a knot that would loosen by noon, shoes she had repaired twice already, a coat that had seen better winters but still did its job. There was nothing tragic about her routine. That was the point. She packed a lunch that could survive a backpack jostled by crowded sidewalks. She slipped a folded paperback into her bag, knowing she would lend it out before she ever finished it herself. By the time she locked her door, the day had already asked things of her: attention, effort, small patience, and she had answered without complaint. Leora didn't believe in waiting for conditions to improve before showing up to her life. She had learned early that consistency was its own kind of protection. When you get up every morning regardless of mood or noise or uncertainty, you stop measuring your worth by how easy things feel. Somewhere between the rattling bus and the block where she always crossed against the signal, she reminded herself of the same thought she carried like a pocket charm. This is enough for today. By the time Leora unlocked the door to the community center, the hallway already smelled faintly of instant coffee and old paper. The building sat between a payday lender and a beauty supply store that never seemed to close, an address most owners skipped when they mailed in their checks. Inside, the classrooms were narrow and bright in stubborn ways, their whiteboards permanently ghosted with the remains of last week's grammar drills. The students drifted in with the posture of people who had already spent a full day awake. Some worked night shifts stocking shelves. Others watched siblings while their parents stitched together two jobs that still didn't meet rent. They dropped into chairs as if gravity had doubled overnight. Leora never asked them why they looked tired. She began the way she always did, not with rules or reminders, but with a line from a novel she loved, spoken slowly enough for it to land. Literature, to her, was less about mastery and more about permission. Permission to imagine other exits, other endings, other versions of themselves that weren't defined by utility or survival. By the middle of the hour, the room would change temperature, shoulders lifted, voices sharpened. Someone always argued about a sentence like it mattered. When the session ended, they left differently than they arrived, not lighter exactly, but steadier, as if they had been briefly returned to themselves. Leora gathered the abandoned pencils and half-filled worksheets long after the hallway had emptied, aware that no one was counting these moments except her. That invisibility didn't wound her, it anchored her. The cafe sat 3 blocks from the center, squeezed between a shoe repair shop and a florist that only looked alive on weekends. It was never loud enough to demand attention, which is why Leora liked it. She ordered the same thing every morning, black coffee, no lid, and waited by the counter while the barista finished a conversation that always seemed more important than her. She tipped more than she could afford, not out of charity but recognition. It was her way of saying, "I see you working even when nobody says your name." Her seat was the small table near the window where the sun arrived late and left early. From there she watched people rehearse their lives, a woman mouthing interview answers to her reflection, a man counting change twice before committing to a pastry, a teenager pretending not to check for messages that never came. Leora rarely interrupted anything, until she did. There was a subtle difference between solitude and distress, and she noticed it without congratulating herself. When a stranger sat too long with their hands wrapped around a cup they weren't drinking, Leora would ask a simple question about the weather or the bus schedule, anything that allowed someone to speak without admitting they needed to. Most mornings passed without consequence. She finished her coffee, tucked her paperback away, and left before anyone attached meaning to her presence. That anonymity suited her. It let her move through the world without being drafted into it. Leora had learned how to keep certain thoughts folded neatly, like letters she never mailed. She rarely spoke about the quiet anxiety that followed her home at night, the sense that places built on volume had a way of erasing people who didn't raise their voices. California celebrated the bold, the amplified, the curated. It rewarded spectacle and punished hesitation. And though she loved the state in ways she couldn't fully explain, she understood its appetite for turning lives into narratives that no longer belonged to the people living them. What unsettled her was not the possibility of failure, but of dilution, becoming agreeable when she meant to be honest, becoming visible for reasons that had nothing to do with her values. She had seen it happen to colleagues who started chasing donors instead of students, who softened their edges until nothing distinct remained. so she protected her margins. She kept her apartment small, her circle narrow, her ambitions grounded in things that didn't generate applause, not because she lacked imagination, but because she feared a future in which her life grew louder, while her inner voice grew faint. In a state that celebrated dissent, her greatest discipline was staying intact. Benjamin Jones measured time in air miles. His plane was configured like a mobile apartment, leather seating arranged to suggest comfort, a narrow desk bolted near the window so he could pretend work followed him willingly, a galley stocked with whatever someone had decided he liked this month. There was always quiet on board, the kind that comes from insulation designed to keep reality outside. He never looked out the window during takeoff. Clouds held no novelty when your schedule allowed you to cross them weekly. Instead, he read briefing folders printed in fonts chosen to reduce strain, each page summarizing conversations he had not yet had, decisions he would be credited for, long before anyone felt their impact. The aircraft lifted smoothly, and no one acknowledged it, because nothing in his life required acknowledgement anymore. There were attendants who addressed him by last name and waited for approval that never felt personal. There were assistants whose faces he recognized but whose voices he could not place. Even the pilot remained a concept rather than a person, a reassuring update over the intercom, a voice without consequence. Somewhere over the desert, the cabin lights dimmed without his consent, and the jet became a corridor between obligations. He had once thought this freedom, the ability to leave any city without preparing for absence. Now it felt more like a refusal to arrive anywhere fully. At 40,000 feet, with a meeting already shaping itself in his calendar, Benjamin realized that nothing around him required anything human from him. Not patience, not curiosity, not explanation, just presence. Boardrooms across California had begun to look identical to him. Polished tables reflecting people who rarely met each other's eyes. Slide decks arranged like careful arguments no one wanted to own. Consultants praising outcomes that had been decided before anyone sat down. When Benjamin entered, conversations adjusted their tone as if someone had turned an invisible dial. There was always a moment, brief, practiced, when the room acknowledged him. Chairs shifted, smiles widened by degrees that could not be measured but were unmistakable. He would nod, take his seat, and listen as the world summarized itself in metrics. They applauded him for patience when he had barely been present. They credited him for vision when he had approved whatever allowed the company to move faster. If someone challenged a proposal, the room waited to see his reaction before finishing the thought, as though their own certainty required his permission. The applause arrived at the end of every meeting, not the loud kind, the restrained version used by people who want to appear discerning. It was meant to signal respect. To Benjamin, it sounded like completion without connection. He tried once to redirect a discussion toward the people affected by one of their expansions. The silence that followed lasted less than 2 seconds, but it lingered long enough to tell him everything. Someone gently steered the agenda back to profit projections, and the moment evaporated as if it had never belonged in the room at all. By lunchtime, he could not recall who had spoken or what had been decided, only that the meeting had gone well. It always did. Benjamin stopped acknowledging his birthday in his early 30s. At first it had been practical. Travel schedules didn't allow for pauses, and celebrations required a kind of participation he could no longer fake. But as the years stacked, the avoidance hardened into something more deliberate. Assistants were instructed not to flag the date. Cards were filtered out before they reached his desk. Any mention of it was met with a polite deflection that closed the subject. The strange thing was not that people complied, it was how relieved they seemed to be. A birthday implied reflection. It invited questions about whether the last year had meant anything beyond growth charts and favorable coverage. It forced attention toward a person rather than a position, and no one in Benjamin's orbit knew how to do that without rehearsing first. Once, a junior executive tried to organize a quiet lunch in his honor. The gesture was clumsy, sincere, and immediately corrected by someone higher up who insisted it would be inappropriate. The lunch never happened. The young man apologized later for having misjudged the situation, as if kindness itself required clearance. Benjamin marked the day privately, not with gratitude or regret, but with inventory. Another year where the numbers improved. Another year where nothing personal had been allowed to interfere. He told himself it was efficiency. Yet every year, when the date passed unnoticed, something hollow followed him home. Benjamin did not lack access to people. His calendar was crowded with introductions, strategy sessions, networking dinners that required tailored suits and half-truths delivered with confidence. Invitations arrived faster than he could decline them, and when he did attend, someone always found a way to position themselves near him. A casual brush of shoulders, a question that sounded curious but carried ambition underneath. What he lacked was friction. No one disagreed with him in ways that felt honest. No one interrupted him without apology. Even his silences were interpreted generously, as though absence of response were itself a form of leadership. Over time, this shaped him. He became careful with his expressions, economical with humor, alert to the smallest shifts in a room that might signal approval or risk. The habits were useful. They were also isolating. On evenings when he returned to one of his homes, it hardly mattered which, the quiet followed him inside. Not the restful kind, but the quiet of a life lived in public terms. He would pour a drink he did not particularly enjoy and stand near a window overlooking a city that knew his name but not his temperament. Power kept him surrounded. It did not keep him accompanied. The bell above the cafe door sounded thin, like it was tired of announcing people. Benjamin barely registered it when he stepped inside. He had taken the walk from his parked car to avoid another call, coat still buttoned, phone set to silent in his pocket. The room held the mild scent of burnt espresso and sugared pastries that had been sitting too long in their case. It was late morning, that hour when rush had passed but no one had fully relaxed. Then the sound dropped away. Not completely. Cups still met saucers, a blender hummed behind the counter, but something in the room recalibrated. Conversations bent toward him without finishing their sentences. He felt it in the brief delay before the barista greeted him, in the way a man near the window adjusted his posture as though a photo were about to be taken. Benjamin paused just inside the door, allowing the coat rack to hide half of him. This was a habit learned from too many rooms that noticed him too fast. He waited for the rhythm of the place to recover. It didn't. Across the cafe, a woman sat alone in a corner booth with her hands folded tightly around a paper cup. She wasn't crying loudly. In fact, she was making a remarkable effort not to. The muscles in her face held still in a way that asked for privacy, while knowing none would be given. He noticed the contrast immediately. The room had organized itself around his arrival, yet it was her distress that altered the air. For a brief second, he thought someone would move toward her, the barista, another customer, but no one did. They held their routines as if fear were contagious. Then a chair scraped lightly against the floor. Leora had been standing at the counter when the bell rang. She turned out of habit, not interest, saw a tall man in a tailored coat pause just inside the door, and dismissed him as quickly as he had entered her field of vision. The crying woman held her attention in a way that required no explanation. There was a specific stillness to people who were trying not to be seen. Leora picked up her coffee before it finished cooling and crossed the room without asking permission from anyone. Not the barista, not the stranger who had arrived to silent recognition, not the social gravity that typically kept people in their own corners. She slid into the booth opposite the woman with the folded cup. "You don't owe anyone your tears," she said quietly, as if this were something you could remind a person of. The woman blinked, startled more by being noticed than by the words. Her shoulders dropped a fraction, and in that small release, something human returned to the space between them. Leora didn't touch her. She didn't offer advice. She simply stayed. Benjamin watched from across the room, coffee forgotten at his side. He was accustomed to being the reason rooms changed temperature. This time the shift had nothing to do with him. Someone else had claimed the moment. It was the cup that betrayed him. Benjamin reached for his coffee and misjudged the edge of the counter, the sleeve of his coat catching the rim just enough to tilt it. The liquid spilled in a dark arc across the floor and toward the booth where Leora sat. The woman across from her flinched back, but Leora reacted first, lifting her bag out of harm's way without standing. "I don't accept bribes for accidents," she said, her voice level, as if this were not a disruption but an introduction. He laughed before he had time to correct himself, a short sound that surprised them both. "I was aiming for sympathy," he replied, crouching to blot the floor with a napkin offered too late by the barista. She studied him without urgency, not the way people usually assessed him. There was no inventory in her gaze, no calculation, only curiosity, clean and unguarded. "What if I just want to sit with you?" he asked, straightening. She considered this as though it were a genuine question. "Then sit," she said, sliding her bag aside to make room. They spoke about nothing that could be leveraged, used bookstores that had closed without warning, train delays that turned strangers into companions, the relief of finding a pen when you had given up on one. He never said what he did. She never asked. When the woman in the booth thanked Leora and left, neither of them noticed right away. They were already elsewhere. Benjamin realized something was wrong when he stopped checking the time. His phone stayed dark in his pocket while their conversation wandered through small, unguarded territory. She talked about novels she loved for sentences rather than plots, about a second-hand bookstore that closed because the owner refused to install a card reader, about how ocean fog made the city feel temporary. No one had asked him for anything in almost 20 minutes. No introductions were made on his behalf. No one angled for proximity. The barista didn't look over to see whether he needed a refill. The cafe returned to its ordinary rhythm, and for once, he was not required to conduct it. What unsettled him most was not the absence of attention. It was how quickly his body adapted to it. His shoulders lowered. The careful, neutral tone he used in meetings faded from his voice. He spoke more slowly, as if he were remembering how conversation worked when no one was keeping score. She didn't perform interest. She listened. When he hesitated mid-sentence, she didn't rush to fill the space. She let the silence hold until he found the rest of the thought on his own. That small courtesy, so rarely offered, shifted something he hadn't known was off balance. For the first time in years, Benjamin felt chosen rather than evaluated, not for what he could offer, but for the fact that he was there at all, and that frightened him more than any negotiation ever had. Let's pause here, before the story carries them any further. Think about the spaces you move through every day. The classroom, the workplace, the group chat, the room where people already expect something from you. Now imagine walking into a place where no one knows your history, your achievements, or the version of you that gets applauded. Who would you become in that silence? Would your words change if no one was waiting to agree? Would your choices look different if admiration stopped steering the room? I'd really like to hear your answer. Share in the comments who you believe you are when no one is impressed, because that version of you is often the one that decides everything that comes next. They did not announce their first real date. There was no agreement that this walk along the coast counted as anything other than two people killing time between obligations. Yet Benjamin found himself arriving early, coat folded over his arm, standing where the footpath curved toward the water as if he were waiting for permission to exist there. Leora arrived without apology, hair caught in the wind, eyes already tuned to the weather rather than to him. The coastline erased formality. The salt in the air made conversation economical. They walked without keeping score of who led, sometimes drifting close enough that their shoulders brushed, sometimes separating to watch a wave break the way it wanted to rather than the way postcards preferred. He spoke about cities he had learned only from conference rooms. She told him how the fog changed neighborhoods more than politics ever did. When he asked why she taught instead of writing, he had assumed everyone who loved books wanted to publish something. She shrugged. I like being present for the moment when someone realizes they're not broken, she said. The answer unsettled him, not because it was noble, but because it was unnecessary. No resume could be built from it. They passed a couple posing near the railing, camera held high by a stranger. Leora slowed until they were clear of the performance, choosing a quieter stretch of path that curved away from the crowd. There, the sound of waves replaced the scattered talk behind them. Benjamin noticed the ease with which she moved toward privacy without explaining herself. It wasn't avoidance. It was preference. By the time they turned back, shoes damp from spray, he realized he had not mentioned work once, and she had not asked. The bookstore had lost its sign years earlier. You could pass it twice before noticing the narrow door wedged between a tailor and a closed travel agency. Inside, the aisles bent slightly, as if the shelves had been installed by people who trusted instinct more than measurements. Dust clung to the spines in affectionate layers. Leora moved through the stacks without scanning for value. She read titles aloud the way other people hummed, half for herself, half as invitation. Benjamin trailed behind, hands in his pockets, unsure what he was meant to do in a place where nothing could be expedited. She stopped in front of a shelf labeled simply unsorted. This is where I come when I don't want to be reminded of what I already know, she said, pulling out a thin paperback whose cover had surrendered most of its color. She flipped to a passage and held the book between them. He leaned closer without thinking, their heads nearly touching as he read the paragraph. The words weren't important. What mattered was the posture required to share them, a narrowing of distance that felt private without being deliberate. No one in the shop noticed. The clerk behind the counter was busy arguing with a radio. A woman nearby was absorbed in a cookbook written decades earlier. Benjamin became, for the length of a page, a man whose proximity did not rearrange a room. Leora slid the book back into place and chose another, this time for him. "You don't have to buy it," she said. "Just carry it for a while." He did. The weight in his hand was trivial, yet he felt strangely entrusted. They stood on opposite sides of the platform when the announcement came. Delays were common enough that no one bothered to complain, but the air shifted in the small way it always does when time loosens its grip. Leora leaned against a column with her bag looped around her ankle. Benjamin checked the digital board, then stopped himself from doing it again. "You look like you're calculating escape routes," she said. "I am," he replied. "It's a habit." The words landed heavier than he had intended. She didn't soften them for him. "From what?" she asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Trains passed on distant tracks, stirring the wind around them, and for a moment he considered giving her something rehearsed. Instead, he said the thing that had no rehearsal. "From rooms where I'm supposed to already know who I am." Leora studied him with the same attention she gave her students when they were close to admitting something real. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," he said, and surprised himself by adding, "I don't think I've ever told anyone that." They waited in a silence that didn't demand repair. When the train finally arrived, they boarded different cars without discussing it, knowing they would meet at the other end. Vulnerability had quietly become portable. The playlist began as a compromise. Benjamin sent her a song he had once loved before work schedules had taught him to forget it. Leora replied with something recorded so long ago it carried the soft hiss of a different era. Neither of them commented on the choices. They let the list grow without editing each other. Soon it became a record of how they were learning to speak. There were tracks that arrived late at night without context. Others appeared mid-afternoon, as if someone had briefly thought of the other and acted on it before logic interfered. The list had no theme, no mood requirement. It tolerated contradiction. Benjamin listened while flying between cities he barely noticed anymore. The music filled the sterile quiet of his plane with moments he could not summarize. A verse about longing, a chorus that sounded like someone finding their footing. For once, he wasn't being introduced to a person through headlines or reputation. He was being invited into her interior weather. Leora played the same songs while grading papers at her kitchen table, letting unfamiliar rhythms change the pace of her evening. Sometimes she guessed at what had prompted a particular track. Sometimes she didn't try. Trust, she was learning, was less about understanding everything and more about allowing room for things that didn't require immediate clarity. By the time the list reached 50 songs, it had become something neither of them named but both protected. Not evidence. Connection. It happened first in fragments. A waiter hesitated before setting down their plates, eyes flicking between Benjamin's face and the screen of a phone he tried to lower discreetly. A couple at the next table spoke more quietly than necessary, their attention moving in short, controlled glances that never quite met his. Benjamin had learned to ignore this choreography. He had even perfected a neutral expression that discouraged escalation. Yet this time, the shift mattered because Leora was there, tracing circles on the condensation of her glass, unaware that the room was beginning to pivot. When a stranger approached, it was with the soft insistence of someone who believed access was implied. "I don't mean to interrupt," the man said, already interrupting. "But are you—" Benjamin nodded before the name was spoken. He kept it small, hoping the acknowledgement would contain the moment. It didn't. The man thanked him for something vague, inspiration, leadership, the sort of praise that floated free of detail, and stepped away only after securing a nod that could be interpreted as approval. Leora looked up, curious but not unsettled. "Do you know him?" she asked. Benjamin hesitated, not because he was hiding anything, but because he had not yet decided what the truth would do to them. "A little," he said, and watched her accept the answer without probing. The rest of the meal unfolded with the same outward ease, yet the air between them had altered. Every time the door opened, Benjamin felt the room recalibrate again, as though someone had switched on a current he could no longer pretend not to feel. Leora noticed the change only in how often he glanced toward the window. Something that had belonged only to him had started to spill outward, and he had no idea how to gather it back. Leora found out the way most people do now, not through confession, but through the quiet verdict of a screen. She was riding the bus home when her phone vibrated with a message from a former student. It wasn't unusual. They often sent her articles about authors they were discovering or photos of library cards proudly renewed. This one was a link with no explanation. She opened it without thinking. The headline didn't mention her, but the image beneath it was unmistakable. Benjamin, stepping out of a building she recognized from their walks, captured mid-laugh in a way she had never seen online before. The article cataloged acquisitions, influence, market projections, language she associated with donors, not dates. She read it twice, not because she was shocked, but because the familiarity of his face in a context so far removed from her own felt dislocating. She searched his name, then stopped herself halfway through the results. It was not curiosity that slowed her thumb. It was restraint. When she arrived at her apartment, she set the phone down on the kitchen counter and made tea as if nothing had changed. The kettle hissed. The floorboard near the sink complained as usual. Her life had not shifted in any visible way, yet the ground beneath it had. That evening, Benjamin sent her a song, something gentle, unremarkable. She added it to their list and said nothing. Sometimes the most significant discoveries are the ones we do not announce. Leora did not confront him. She went to work the next morning and listened to a student explain, with shaky confidence, why a sentence deserved to survive revision. She ordered her coffee, tipped the same amount, took the same seat near the window. If anyone was watching closely, they would have found nothing to report. Inside, however, she had begun sorting memories differently. His careful pauses, the way he never offered a last name, how he paid in cash even when there was no reason to. None of it felt deceptive, now, only protective, as though he had been trying to exist without the echo that followed him everywhere else. When they met later that afternoon, she did not mention the article. They walked as usual, letting the conversation find its own pace. He spoke about a delayed flight. She told him about a novel one of her students was writing in secret. He waited for something to fracture. Nothing did. That unsettled him. He had rehearsed explanations in his head since the first stranger approached them. He'd prepared to apologize for a detail he had not known how to introduce. But Leora gave him no opening. Her calm was not indifference. It was something more difficult to read. As they parted, she touched his wrist briefly. Not to reassure, not to question, only to acknowledge the contact that had always been enough before information complicated it. Benjamin watched her walk away, aware that whatever had changed had done so without ceremony. Truth had entered the room, and she had chosen not to let it perform. The next time they met, the world seemed eager to clarify what she had declined to name. A pair of people approached Benjamin outside a bookstore they had visited weeks earlier, their phones already half raised in what might have been caution or ambition. He intercepted them gently, exchanging a few words that sent them on their way. When he turned back to Leora, there was apology in his posture. "This happens sometimes," he said, as if the phrase were meant to shrink the moment. She nodded, eyes following the retreating figures. "I know." It was the first time she had acknowledged knowing anything at all. They walked in silence for a block, the kind that does not ask to be filled. When she spoke, it was not to accuse him, but to name the difference she could now feel pressing between them. "When people see you," she said, "they don't just see you. They see access." He tried to respond and failed, because there was no version of denial that would not sound dishonest. She continued, not unkindly, "It's not your fault, but it changes the air around us." For the first time, Benjamin felt the scale he carried, not as leverage or protection, but as mass, something that bent conversations before they were spoken. They reached the corner where they usually separated, and neither of them moved right away. Nothing had ended, yet the relationship now had weight. The road narrowed as they climbed, trading storefronts for walls of stone that blocked the city until only sky remained. Leora watched the scenery retreat in layers, the corner markets, the worn apartment blocks, the neighborhoods where people leaned out of windows to argue about nothing important. By the time the car reached the gate, the world she knew had folded itself out of sight. The house waited beyond a quiet curve in the drive, pale against the cliffs as if it had been placed there for observation rather than living. Its windows faced the ocean with disciplined symmetry, too many of them, all empty. No laughter escaped, no music leaked. The place was complete without requiring anyone inside it. Benjamin parked and opened her door himself. It was a gesture that arrived late enough to feel tentative. "I don't usually bring people here," he said. She stepped out, the wind catching her hair immediately, as if reminding her that the edge of land had its own temperament. The sound of the waves rose from below in a steady rhythm that refused to echo the quiet of the structure above them. Inside, the rooms were immaculate without warmth. Furniture stood as though it had been instructed to maintain distance. Art was arranged for balance rather than conversation. She walked slowly, not from awe, but from the strange caution reserved for spaces that have never needed you. Benjamin watched her take it in, searching her face for the response he had been conditioned to expect. There was no gasp, no reflexive praise, only a careful inventory, as if she were determining what kind of life could exist here without being absorbed by the architecture. "This place feels like a statement," she said finally. "About what?" he asked. She did not answer right away. Instead, she moved closer to a window overlooking the drop toward the sea, where nothing could be added without drawing attention to itself. "About distance," she said. It began before they even left the driveway. A camera lens protruded from a parked car down the hill, retreating only after Benjamin's driver made a slow circle past it. By the time they reached the coast road, 2 motorcycles trailed at a polite distance that was meant to feel accidental. Leora said nothing. At the restaurant, the host greeted them with practiced ease while signaling someone in the back. Their table was perfect, not because it was comfortable, but because it could be seen. A woman at the bar turned openly in her seat. A man pretended to adjust his jacket while angling his phone. Benjamin tried to keep the conversation light. He told her about a deal that had fallen through in a way that was supposed to sound humorous. She nodded, but her eyes tracked the movement around them, mapping the perimeter as though learning the limits of a room she had not agreed to enter. By dessert, a blog had already published a headline speculating about her name. She discovered it when a message appeared on her phone from someone she had not spoken to in years. "Is this you?" it read, followed by a link she did not open. Benjamin noticed the change in her posture, the way her shoulders aligned with the exit rather than with him. "I can fix this," he said too quickly. She held his gaze. "You didn't break it," she replied, and then, softer, "but it doesn't ask me before it happens." For the rest of the night, attention followed them like a current, not loud, persistent. By the time the car carried them back up the hill, Leora felt as though she had been rendered into a surface others could read without ever meeting her. Her life had not been invited. It had been claimed. Leora stood alone in the upstairs bathroom while the house settled into its evening quiet. The mirror was larger than the one in her apartment, framed by lights that softened every angle. She leaned closer, studying the version of herself that had already begun circulating without her consent, a name attached to speculation, a face interpreted by people who had never heard her voice. She thought of her students and how easily stories were assigned to them before they had the language to resist. She had spent years teaching them to claim their own narratives, to write past the expectations placed on them. Now she felt the machinery she had warned them about turning toward her. Downstairs she could hear Benjamin on the phone, voice lowered, choosing words designed to manage outcomes. The sound did not comfort her. It clarified something she had been trying not to articulate. This house did not belong to him. It belonged to the world that had formed around him, and by stepping inside it, she had become legible to that world in ways she could not undo. Her teaching, her anonymity, the small permission she had granted herself, all of it was now at risk of being rewritten into a version that required no explanation. She turned off the light and let the room return to shadow, unwilling to rehearse the role being prepared for her. It was not the attention that frightened her. It was the loss of authorship. Before we move on, take a moment with this. Have you ever stepped into a situation that looked like opportunity on paper, only to realize it had begun defining you in ways you never chose? A school, a relationship, a career path that slowly replaced your intentions with its own momentum. If this part of the story feels familiar, let me know by leaving a like. It helps this channel reach others who may be standing at a similar crossroads. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter, because the choices Leora faces from here will only grow heavier. Leora did not break in front of anyone. It happened in the early hours when the house had no audience, and even the ocean below had lowered its voice. She lay awake on unfamiliar sheets, listening to a building settle around her, aware of how carefully everything in this place had been designed to remain untouched. Her phone rested face down on the bedside table. She had stopped reading messages after the third one that began with her name and ended with a question she did not recognize as her own. Each vibration felt like a hand reaching through glass. She tried to remember the last time her life had required explanation, the last morning she had moved through her day without someone elsewhere deciding what it meant. The memory refused to form. Instead, images crowded in. The woman in the cafe booth, her students arguing over a sentence, the bookstore aisle where no one had known who they were. Those spaces now felt fragile, as though they could be erased simply by being remembered too loudly. Her chest tightened not with panic, but with something closer to grief. She had not lost Benjamin. She was losing the conditions under which she could remain herself. In the dark, she sat up and pressed her palms together until the sensation anchored her. It was a habit from years earlier, one she had taught a student who needed to locate their body before they could locate their thoughts. Only now did she understand how much she depended on that anchoring herself. By the time the horizon hinted at morning, Leora knew that whatever decision was coming would not arrive with drama. It would arrive with necessity. Leora had once believed that being cared for was a simple exchange, attention for presence, listening for listening. What she was learning now was that attention could also be directional, aimed not at who she was, but at who she was becoming in the public imagination. The comments, the headlines she refused to read, the sudden interest from people who had never known her when she mattered less, none of it came from Benjamin directly. Yet all of it bent the relationship around him. Conversations began with logistics rather than curiosity. Silence was filled with strategy. She noticed how often he spoke about what they would do next rather than how they were, how easily her concerns were met with reassurance instead of understanding. "I'm not unhappy," she tried to explain once. "I'm displaced." He held her hands and promised to protect her. The word landed wrong. Protection implied threat, and she could no longer tell whether the danger was outside their relationship or braided into it. Being loved publicly, she realized, had little to do with being known privately. One required image, the other required listening, and in a world already committed to telling her who she was, she could not afford to lose the few spaces where she was allowed to decide for herself. Leora wrote the message at the small desk overlooking the water, a place that had never learned her habits. She did not draft it. She did not rehearse tone or anticipate reaction. The words arrived with the clarity of something that had been forming long before she knew it needed language. "You deserve someone who wants your world. I deserve to keep mine." There were other sentences she could have added, apologies, explanations, soft landings, but each one felt like a negotiation. This was not a negotiation. It was a boundary she had waited too long to draw. She folded the paper once, then again, until it was small enough to slip into the pocket of his jacket hanging by the door. Her hand lingered there, feeling the familiar weight of the fabric as if it might carry the imprint of him without the consequences. In the quiet, she looked around the room one last time, not with resentment, but with relief. This house had offered her nothing to miss. When she turned away from the desk, the ocean beyond the window was beginning to brighten, a thin seam of light marking the edge of a day that would unfold without her. She left the pen where it was. There would be no revisions. Leora did not announce herself. She moved through the house as she had on her first evening, slowly, without asking it to accommodate her. The door closed with the same reserved sound it always made, as if it had been trained not to acknowledge departures. Outside, the air was sharp with salt and early morning cool. The drive curved away from the structure until the building no longer held her in its lines. She did not look back, not out of anger, but because she had already taken everything she needed with her. At the gate, she paused long enough to breathe in the scent of eucalyptus drifting from the hillside. Somewhere below, the ocean continued its steady labor, unconcerned with exits. By the time the first car passed her on the road, she had become anonymous again, another woman walking with intention, no audience required. Whatever waited for her next would not be louder. It would be hers. The community center had not noticed her absence in any visible way. The same flyer still peeled from the hallway corkboard. The same desk wobbled in the third classroom. Yet when Leora stepped inside, the building met her with a familiarity she had not realized she was carrying back like a fragile object. Her students arrived with their usual exhaustion, dropping bags as if the day had already asked too much of them. A boy in the back row announced he had failed a math test with theatrical despair. Someone else argued about punctuation before she had finished writing the date on the board. No one asked where she had been. They did not need to. Her presence was not something that required explanation. She began the lesson without preface, letting a paragraph from a short story guide them into discussion. The room warmed in the way it always did, not physically, but in attention. People leaned forward. Someone laughed at a line that had nothing to do with humor. By the time the hour ended, a student who rarely spoke was defending a character's mistake with more conviction than she had heard from him all year. Afterward, Leora lingered to straighten chairs that had never been straightened in their lives. A girl stayed behind to ask if a poem could change meaning depending on who read it. Leora answered honestly that the reader always leaves fingerprints on the words. As the hallway emptied, she realized something had shifted back into place. Her life had resumed its size, not smaller than before, but once again proportioned to her. Here, she did not need to be interpreted. She only needed to show up. The fundraiser was held in a converted warehouse on the edge of downtown San Jose, a building that had once sorted freight and now gathered intentions. Strings of simple lights stretched across the ceiling, not to impress, but to make the room navigable. Long tables were lined with donated books, their covers mismatched, their pages carrying the faint scent of hands that had passed them along. Leora arrived early to help set out pamphlets, the kind printed on modest paper that curled at the corners before the night was over. Volunteers moved between crates of supplies with focused urgency. No one waited to be asked. This was not a room that rewarded hierarchy. As people filtered in, the atmosphere held a particular kind of attentiveness. Donors spoke in lowered voices. Teachers clustered near the stage where a local poet would read later. Students hovered around the refreshment table, pretending not to care who was watching. Leora greeted faces she recognized from other events, exchanging updates that were brief but sincere. This was her vocabulary. Hours volunteered, library cards renewed, programs extended by one more semester because someone had said yes when it would have been easier not to. By the time the room filled, the hum settled into something almost reverent. It was not excitement that carried the evening, but alignment. Everyone there understood the currency being traded was not money alone, but faith in what could still be taught. Leora took her place near the side of the room, collecting donation envelopes and thanking people for contributions that arrived in uneven amounts. She had not looked up when the doors opened again, had not noticed the shift until the sound of the room adjusted around someone new. She was counting a stack of pamphlets when she felt it, that subtle recalibration of attention she had once come to recognize too well. She lifted her head. Benjamin stood just inside the entrance, coat draped over his arm, scanning the room as if he were searching for an exit rather than a person. The lights above had not been arranged to flatter anyone, and without the context that usually traveled with him, he appeared almost out of place, a man uncertain which version of himself was required. Leora saw him at the same moment he found her. They did not wave. They did not smile. For a second, neither of them moved, caught between the past they shared and the future they had not rehearsed. Around them, the fundraiser continued its quiet labor, someone adjusting a microphone, a child flipping through a book with exaggerated seriousness. All of it indifferent to the fact that two lives were recalibrating. Benjamin took the first step, not toward her, but toward the table beside her, pretending to examine a stack of novels he did not need. Leora finished the count she had started, placed the envelopes into a folder, and closed it with care. Only then did she turn. "You came," she said, not as invitation, but as acknowledgement. He nodded. "I was in the area." It was not a lie, but it was not the reason. They stood close enough to speak without raising their voices, yet far enough apart to avoid the familiarity they had not yet earned back. The room offered them no privacy, only neutrality. In that neutrality, the absence of everything that had once surrounded them felt almost disarming. No drivers waiting, no phones angling for proof, just two people, meeting again in a place that had never belonged to either of them alone. They stepped outside when the poet began to read. The loading dock had been left unfinished on purpose, its concrete softened by years of use rather than renovation. From there, the noise of the fundraiser thinned into a distant murmur. Not gone, but reduced to context. Benjamin leaned against the railing, hands in his pockets as if he were waiting for instructions that never came. "I didn't know how to reach you," he said. "You could have tried," Leora replied, without accusation. He nodded again, this time with something closer to recognition. "I was afraid anything I said would sound like a strategy." She considered that, then said it probably would have. The honesty between them did not ask to be smoothed over. It allowed them to say less and mean more. He told her he had followed her work online, in the limited ways it was visible, that he had learned which organizations she trusted, which projects mattered to her. She told him that absence had been harder than distance, that walking away had not simplified anything. Neither of them mentioned money. They spoke instead about a student who had published a poem in a local paper, about a city bus that never arrived on time, about the fatigue that gathers in the joints when life becomes too complicated to name. The conversation was unguarded in a way that would have been impossible in rooms that expected outcomes. Leora watched his face as he listened, noticing the ease that had been missing before. The power that once bent the air between them had loosened its hold, at least here, where no one had come to see him. When the poet inside finished and the applause drifted through the open doors, Benjamin turned to her and said quietly, "I don't want to find you by accident again." She met his gaze without yielding it. "Then don't," she said. They stayed on the dock while the fundraiser shifted behind them, the room reorganizing itself for the next speaker. Benjamin spoke as if the words had been rehearsing him, rather than the other way around. "I've been trying to live the same life without you in it," he said. "It works on paper." She did not interrupt. "I don't want the house," he continued. "I don't want the circuit. I don't want to keep pretending the access is the point." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. I would walk away from all of it if it meant we could be people again. Leora exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recalibration. "You can't offer that like it's a gift," she said. "It has to be something you choose even if I don't say yes." He nodded. "I know. I'm saying it because I already started." For the first time that night, something in her expression shifted, not toward trust but toward curiosity. They stood there, neither of them reaching across the space that remained between their hands, aware that whatever came next could not be shaped by urgency. Inside, someone called for volunteers. Outside, two people considered what it would take to leave without being chased. They did not plan their departure the way people usually plan escapes. There was no countdown, no symbolic last meal in a place they pretended to love. Leora finished the semester she had promised her students. Benjamin untangled himself from meetings one by one, declining invitations that assumed permanence. Their conversations were spare, practical, grounded in what could be carried rather than what would be left behind. The night they drove north, California felt uncharacteristically restrained. The highways emptied earlier than expected, the lights thinning until only the occasional sign punctuated the dark. They said little in the car. Words, they had learned, were less useful than alignment. At a rest stop somewhere between cities, Leora stepped out to stretch and watch the traffic move past without curiosity. Once, she would have wondered who was traveling where and why. Now she recognized the freedom in not needing to narrate every exit. Benjamin returned with 2 cups of gas station coffee, the kind that tasted like compromise. He handed her one without ceremony, and they leaned against the hood, letting the engine tick itself quiet. "This doesn't feel dramatic," he said. "It's not supposed to," she replied. They merged back onto the road before the moment could become something they would feel obliged to remember. By the time the first hint of morning found them, the coastline was far behind, its presence reduced to memory rather than obligation. They were not chasing a new beginning. They were choosing a smaller center. Their arrival in the next town did not prompt curiosity. They rented a modest place with a porch that faced a row of unremarkable trees, the kind that provided shade without asking to be admired. Leora unpacked her books into a single shelf. Benjamin learned where the light switch was without needing to be shown twice. No one searched their names. No one mistook silence for intrigue. The grocery clerk thanked them the way people do when the transaction is the whole relationship. Leora found work at a learning center that needed instructors more than explanations. Benjamin began consulting in ways that required presence rather than authority, choosing projects he could understand without a team translating their meaning. Their evenings settled into patterns that did not advertise themselves. Dinner cooked without being documented, conversations that drifted instead of steering. On weekends, they walked the neighborhood until it felt navigable by instinct. There were no headlines. There was, instead, the slow relief of being encountered only by people who had reason to be there. In this new anonymity, Leora felt the return of something she had nearly misplaced, the ability to exist without correction. Benjamin noticed it too, though he never named it. He carried groceries without anyone opening doors ahead of him. He waited his turn. He mispronounced the name of a local street and was corrected without ceremony. They were no longer recognizable. They were reachable. "Before the story closes, I want to hear from you," Have you ever imagined what it would feel like to step out of a life that looks impressive and into one that actually fits, even if no one applauds it? Not a fantasy escape, but a quiet decision to become reachable again. If this chapter moved you, take a second to support the channel by liking this video. It tells the platform that stories about presence still matter. And if you're new here, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story we share. Everyone built to remind us that a meaningful life doesn't need an audience. Most of all, tell me in the comments, what would you be willing to leave behind to finally feel like yourself again? The porch faced west, catching the last of the light without insisting on it. Leora sat in a wooden chair that creaked only when she leaned too far back, a book open on her lap more as habit than intention. Benjamin fixed the loose board near the railing with a screwdriver he kept forgetting to put away, pausing now and then to watch a neighbor's dog make the same determined loop around the yard. No one was waiting for them. The town did not require them to be interesting, only present. Their names carried no expectation beyond the mail that arrived in a box at the end of the drive. Evenings arrived gently here, not as events but as conditions. Benjamin joined her with 2 mugs, steam rising unevenly. They didn't speak at first. Silence had become less something to manage and more something to share, like air. Across the street, someone practiced piano badly, stopping to repeat the same mistake. Leora smiled to herself. This, she thought, was the kind of imperfection she could trust. She closed her book and rested it against the chair, leaning her head on Benjamin's shoulder without asking. There was no audience to interrupt the gesture, no reason to register it as anything other than what it was, a moment no one else had to witness to make real. The light thinned. The porch creaked again. Nothing arrived, and nothing needed to. They never spoke about the life they had stepped away from unless something ordinary called it back, a restaurant that reminded Benjamin of a client he no longer remembered, a song that took Leora briefly to a classroom she had loved. What surprised them both was not the absence of what they had left, but the abundance of what had arrived in its place. Mornings unfolded without negotiation. He brewed coffee too strong. She corrected him without ceremony. He listened. She laughed when the neighbor's dog escaped again and recruited him for the rescue. Their arguments were brief and unspectacular, about groceries or the correct way to hang a towel, and ended without anyone retreating into strategy. On her first day at the new learning center, Leora came home with chalk on her sleeve and a story about a teenager who had asked whether words could still matter if nobody noticed them. Benjamin listened as if the answer were something he might need too. At night, he learned the contours of her silence, which ones meant fatigue, which ones meant thought, which ones meant nothing at all. She learned that his restlessness softened when he worked with his hands, that fixing things was not about control but reassurance. They were no longer impressive. They were legible to each other, and in that legibility, the past began to shrink into a set of references rather than a definition. They did not frame their life as a victory. There were no declarations about simplicity, no speeches about choosing differently. Their days were stitched together from tasks that required attention but not admiration, lesson plans revised, invoices answered, evenings spent on a porch that offered nothing beyond space to sit. Yet in the quiet accumulation of those days, something lasting took shape. Benjamin learned that being wanted is not the same as being known. Leora learned that love does not need power to protect it. Neither of them would have said this aloud in those words, but they lived it in 100 small decisions that favored presence over display. In a state that trained people to ascend, they chose to remain where their voices sounded like their own. And that, at last, was enough.